Okay, this is the last lecture we have time to schedule for our treatment of Genesis, so I want to take the rest of the book. Now, the rest of the book is really most of the book, chapters 12 through 50, but it breaks down into four basic, the stories of four basic individuals: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So we'll have to skim rather lightly over these, but it's still not an infinitely large amount of material that has to be covered in our finite period of time. Of course, Abraham is the hero here, not only in this book, but in the whole Bible. There are three major world religions that trace their origins to Abraham: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They all look at Abraham as their ancestor. Of course, Christianity, in the New Testament, he's called our spiritual ancestor. We're spiritually children of Abraham through faith. The Jews and the Arabs are actually physically descended from Abraham. So all three of these religions look to Abraham as their founder, and they honor him. Now, that makes him probably the most honored man in the whole world. I mean, Jesus deserves more honor than Abraham, but the Muslims and the Jews don't give the honor to Jesus that Christians do. And Christians, as well as Jews and Muslims, give honor to Abraham. So a much larger number of people have honored Abraham throughout history and continue to do than any other human being on the planet. And so this man, it's an amazing thing, because he was just an ordinary sheep herder, apparently. And God called him to leave his land, Ur of the Chaldees, and to move to a land that he had never been in, which was occupied by Canaanites and was called the land of Canaan. And God told him, I'm going to give you this land to you and your offspring. Now, Abraham spent 100 years in that land. He was 75 years old when he came to Canaan, and 175 when he died in Canaan. In that 100 years, he never really owned any property. He didn't displace any Canaanites. The Canaanites ruled the land his entire lifetime. He did buy a piece of property from the Canaanites, just a field with a cave in it so he could bury his family. When he first had a family member die, which was his wife, Sarai, he had to negotiate to have some property to bury her. And so he actually purchased a smallish piece of property, apparently. And that's the only property in the Promised Land that he ever owned. And he didn't get it for free. It wasn't given to him. It was purchased from the Hittites, which is one of the Canaanite tribes. So Abraham was promised this land, but it wasn't going to be his in his lifetime. It was going to be someday belonging to his offspring. That really never materialized until the days of Joshua. Abraham's son Isaac and his grandson Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons, never owned much land in Canaan, although Jacob did purchase or win by battle a piece of property in Shechem. For the most part, Abram and his immediate generations after him didn't really own the land and had to pay dearly for whatever bits of real estate they happened to secure there. As we find at the end of Genesis, the entire family left the land of Canaan and was gone for hundreds of years as slaves in Egypt. And then under Moses, they were brought back to the land, or they were actually promised to be brought back then. He got them out of Egypt, but it wasn't until Joshua took leadership that they conquered the land. So then the land that God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob eventually became the possession of their descendants, but not in the lifetime of these men. That's why they are commended for their faith. Abraham lived a whole 100 years in a land that God promised to give him and never saw it materialize. And yet he died in faith. He believed it. I don't see it, but I believe it. God said it. I'm going to trust him about that. And Abraham is known as being remarkable for his faith, although his failures of faith are also recorded in the story. There's about 12 or 13 chapters about Abraham. He dies, I think, in chapter 23, if I'm not mistaken, and his story begins in chapter 12. Actually, those last verses of chapter 11. But in chapter 12, 1 through 3 is where we have the Abrahamic promise given to him. And really, if we don't really spend time looking at any other passage, we should look at least at that one, because that is, as I told you before, the passage which can be said to be the passage about which the rest of the Bible is. The rest of the Bible is like commentary on this passage. So The opening verses of Genesis 12 say, Then the Lord told Abram, he was not yet called Abraham, but Abram, which means exalted father, leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will cause you to become a father of a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and I will make you a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Now, the promise here is that God would personally bless Abram and make a big nation from him, but more than that, he's going to have a global impact. All the nations of the earth, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed through him. Now, this will not be through him personally. He didn't really bless the nations. He just stayed kind of where he was and didn't have a global impact. But later, God clarifies, through your offspring. So many times promises are made to people that are really mean not you personally, but your family that's going to come out of you. Because your family is the extension of you. That's why we call them Jacob. His name was Israel. He had 12 sons. They were the children of Israel. That was a family of 12 sons, children of a man named Israel. Eventually, they became tribes. That was 12 tribes of Israel. Eventually, they became a nation, still called Israel. In the Bible, nations are named after the person that they come from because they're seen as an extension of him. So that the nation of Edom, which came from Esau, is sometimes called Esau. The nation is called Esau. The Amalekites were descended from a man named Amalek. And yet, sometimes the Amalekites are called Amalek. The Midianites came from Midian, and they're called, the nation is called Midian, named after the founder. Because men are considered to live on through their offspring and through the nations that come from them. When God said, Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated, Malachi, he means the nation of Jacob, Israel, had received special favor. The nation of Esau, Edom, had not received special favor. In fact, you see this even in a verse that Paul quotes in Romans 9. It's in Genesis 23:25. I believe that's where it is. That God said to Rebekah, who had married Isaac, Abram's son, she was pregnant, and there were twins in her, and they were having a conflict in the womb, and she inquired of the Lord, and the Lord said, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples, or people groups, ethnic groups, will be divided from you, and one shall be stronger than the other, and the older one will serve the younger one. That's what he said. Now, this was Jacob and Esau in there. He said there's 2 nations in there. Well, no wonder she's feeling full, you know. There were 2 people in there, but they were representative of nations that would come from them. The fate of these people was seen to be realized in the nations that came from them. When he said the older will serve the younger, Esau was the older twin. He came out first. Esau never served Jacob. Never happened. But the Edomites, who came from Esau, did serve Israel. So you can see that God is dealing with these individuals as if they are the nations that would come from them. Typical in the Old Testament, very common. And so when God says to Abram, the nations will be, all the nations of the world will be blessed through you, he means basically through your offspring. And Paul, in Galatians 3:16, tells us that offspring is Jesus. That the promise is made to Abram and his seed. And then Paul says, he doesn't say seeds plural, but seed singular, which is Christ. So essentially, we're looking at this promise that God made to Abram as a promise that he's going to send Jesus. Through the gospel, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And by the way, most of the nations of the world, all have been penetrated by the gospel. Christ has been introduced in every nation. And in a very large number, the nations have been truly blessed. First of all, they've been blessed by many of them becoming saved, Christians. But even besides that, nations often are improved by the influence of Christianity. Human rights improve when the gospel takes hold in the culture. Women's rights, children's rights, the rights of the elderly, hospitals, orphanages, these things are founded by Christians because they are Christians, because Christ and the influence in his church, which is his body, blesses nations, but especially the blessing of justification by faith, which was Abram's own blessing that he received. That's Paul says, the blessing that all nations receive through Christ. So this promise to Abram was about Christ. It was about Abram too. I'll bless you. I'll make you a blessing. I'll make you the father of a great nation. That's personal to you. but through you, that is through the great nation that comes from you, all the nations will be blessed. So this is how the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament and history ever since has been the unfolding of this promise coming true. And we see that thousands of years later, now 4,000 years after Abram, the promise is still coming true, because you guys are going to various nations and bringing Christ to the nations, and that's how this is fulfilled. All right? So, Abram, he doesn't have much to do in those 100 years. God appeared to him a bunch of times. Maybe, I haven't counted them, I'd guess about 8 to 10 times we read of God appearing to Abram and giving him certain instructions, kind of updating him on the plan. But these, let's say there's 10 times, I don't know the exact number, it could be a little less, but these 10 appearances of God occur over a period of 100 years. That's on average once a decade God speaks to him. And yet he's said to be God's friend. The Bible calls Abram the friend of God. God confides in him. That's what God says in Genesis 18. I'm going to not keep a secret from Abraham because he's my friend. I'm going to tell him what I'm going to do. So he's the guy that God confides in about once a decade, you know. God shows up with another few sentences, you know. So, I mean, this tells us something. It means that if we're thinking God's supposed to be speaking to us in audible voices every day to give us guidance, well, then we're expecting something far better than what Abram's, the friend of God, ever received. Even the apostles didn't have God showing up in visions and dreams every day. They had trouble sometimes knowing what God wanted to do, and it took them sometimes a difficulty to find out as you read the book of Acts. But you know, we sometimes think, well, I'm supposed to get a word from God before I decide what cereal I'm going to eat in the morning, you know, so I can know he wants me to eat this cereal or that cereal. Now, we sometimes have unrealistic expectations. Often God just wanted Abram to keep doing the last thing he was told to do. And that's often what we're supposed to do. If you don't have a new word from God, there's plenty of old words from God here. Keep doing these, you know. You can pretty much follow what God said in Scripture safely. Now, he'll give you words. He'll give you direction for special projects and special missions, but maybe not all the time. A lot of times, God just gave Abram a word, and Abram was just supposed to believe it and tend his sheep. You know, God first promised him you're going to be father of a nation, and yet he was in the land for a long time before he even had a child. His son Isaac, which is the one that God promised, was born 25 years later. Here he's a quarter of a century, he's tending sheep. His whole mission in life is to have a child, and God doesn't give him a child. His wife is not even capable of getting pregnant. She's a barren woman, and now by this time she's very old and beyond this childbearing age. So it's like, whoa, you know, how's this promise going to be fulfilled? God said I'm going to be a father of a great nation, but I don't have any kids. Now, he tried to fix that himself at one point, and that was about 12 years after he'd come into the promised land, and God hadn't given him any offspring. And, you know, 12 years can seem like a long time if you're just waiting for something that's been promised to you. 12 years? Think about how long 12 years feels to you. Think of yourself 12 years older than you are right now. Does it seem like a long way out? Probably so. So Abram was that long in the land doing what? Tending sheep mostly. That's all he did. His whole mission was to have a kid, and his wife was barren. He didn't have a kid. So 12 years into it, he says, you know, maybe I'm not doing something right. And his wife says, you know, what you could do is have a kid. I'm barren, but my maid servant, she's probably not barren. You can have a child by her. Now, you might say that sounds pretty immoral. And it wouldn't be something Christians would approve of, but the truth is that in the culture of the time, and remember, no laws had ever been given by God at this point, except that murderers should be put to death. That's what he told Noah. But there was no law of Moses. There was no Christian teaching. There was just Middle Eastern custom. And what few things God had told Abram, which was blessedly few things. So his wife says, you know, it's commonplace. If a man's wife can't have children, if she has a slave, that slave is sort of like an extension of her own body. She owns the slave. That's what slavery is, an owned person. So my slave's womb is my womb. So why don't you have a child through her? Now Abram said, okay. Now, you know, Abram didn't have any interest in sex with this woman, Hagar. He wanted a child, and he got one. Hagar bore a son named Ishmael. Now, for 13 years after that, Abraham assumed that Ishmael was the son that was going to bring blessing to all the nations. He didn't have any other in that 13 years. 13 years is about the time a Jewish boy in later culture was considered to be a man, and probably in Middle Eastern culture generally. So Ishmael's just getting to the age where he's going to take over some family responsibility, be the heir. And then God appears to Abraham again. And this happened in the 17th chapter of Genesis. God appears to Abraham and says a few things. First of all, I want you to circumcise yourself and all the men in your household. Now, he didn't have any men except Ishmael in his family, but he had 300 and something servants, male servants. And so they all had to be circumcised. And God said, everyone from you from now on has got to be circumcised. That's the mark of the covenant I have with you. Second thing, I want you to change your name. Your name's going to be Abraham. This happened in chapter 17. It just adds one syllable to Abram's name, but it means father of a multitude. Now, here's a man who has only one child, and it looks like he's all he's going to get. He got one who's 13 years old and no more in the oven. And so what's he going to do? Well, start calling yourself father of a multitude. You mean when I meet passing, nomadic caravans, they say, hey, what's your name? I'm the father of a multitude. They say, oh, really? Where's your family? Oh, just this kid right here. That'd be kind of embarrassing. But God says, I'm going to make you the father of a multitude, so start talking that way. Start calling yourself father of a multitude. I'm changing your name from this time on. And your calling yourself that will be an expression of your faith in my promise. The third thing was, surprise, surprise, your wife Sarah is going to have a child. By the way, her name is Sarai, and on this occasion, God changed her name to Sarah, which means princess, which is kind of interesting because she's like 90 years old. Give her a nickname, Princess. Sounds cute. But he says she's going to have a child. Now, Abram didn't think that was realistic. Sarai had always been barren. She's now very old. And so he laughed. And God said, what are you laughing about? She said, well, I'm old. And Sarah is old too. And God says, well, don't laugh. You're going to have a child by her. I'm going to make it happen this time next year. And he said, name him Laughter, which would always remind Abraham that it was so impossible that he would be born that Abraham had laughed at the very suggestion. So whenever he called his son Laughter, which is the meaning of the name Isaac, it would remind him how miraculous it was that he was there, that he had at one time laughed at the very thought that this child would exist. Now he's called him Laughter. And later on, God appeared in chapter 18 to Abram as three people, or actually one person with two angels attending, and made the promise again that Sarah would have a child. This time Sarah overheard it in the tent, and she laughed. And God called her on it and said, what are you laughing about? Is anything too hard for Yahweh? And she said, I didn't laugh. He said, oh, but you did laugh. How embarrassing for Sarah to have that recorded,
Thank God.
She laughed, and then she said, I didn't laugh. God says, come on, you know you did. And then on that same occasion, chapter 18, God told Abram he was going to visit Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abram knew, well, if that happens, Sodom and Gomorrah is going to be wiped out. Now, Abram had a nephew, Lot, who lived in Sodom, so he had sort of a vested interest in Sodom not being wiped out. And so God pleaded with God, are you going to wipe the place out? What if there's 50 righteous there? God said, I won't do it if there's 50 righteous. And Abram said, what about 45? God said, I won't do it if there's 45. He said, how about 35? How about 25? How about 10? And all the way through, God was saying, okay, if you ask for me to, I'll spare the city if there's 10 righteous. Abram stopped bargaining at that point, and God went off towards Sodom and Gomorrah. And chapter 19 tells how two angels came to Sodom. They rescued Lot, pulled him and his wife and two daughters out of the city and destroyed the city with fire and brimstone. The wife didn't make it very far, though. She was told not to look back. She apparently stayed back a little further when they were supposed to keep running. And the explosion in the area apparently caused sulfur and salt, which is hugely abundant in that part of the southern Dead Sea area. She got encased in salt, became a pillar of salt, as it was in all likelihood. I mean, she did become a pillar of salt. That doesn't mean her body turned into salt, which could have happened. There's no need to think so. Her looking back suggests that she stopped fleeing. She turned around to watch what's going on, and she was too close for safety. And no doubt the huge explosive destruction of the city caused all kinds of molten salt and sulfur and stuff, and she was watching it, just got caked on it. She became a pillar of salt that way. And by the way, I'm told, I've not seen this, but in that region of the Dead Sea area, I think that Arab guides sometimes point to various salt pillars and say that's Lot's wife there. But she probably isn't still there. Probably she became a big salt lick for the camels, and she would have been licked away by now. Anyway, so after that, we have the birth of Isaac. Now we've got a 16-year-old. Isaac is 13 Ishmael's 13, I think, when Isaac's born. But then when Isaac is weaned, which would be at least 3 or 5 years later, here Ishmael's in his late teens. And he's not liking it. He's not liking the weaning of Isaac, which is a sort of a rite of passage toward his maturing in the family and so forth. And remember, Ishmael had been the only heir to a very wealthy man's fortune until Isaac came along. And then suddenly Isaac's the guy. So Ishmael's kind of resentful toward Isaac and starts mocking him and stuff, and this made Sarah unhappy, and so she threw Ishmael and Hagar out of the family. And Ishmael went off and found an Egyptian wife and eventually gave rise to some nations of his own called Ishmaelites. Most people think modern Arabs have descended from Ishmael. At least the Muslims believe that. Isaac then remained as the favored son in Abram's house and was the one that God said was going to be the one who would fulfill the promises. And so a time came when God wanted to test Abram to see whether he really loved God more than he loved Isaac. Isaac was, after all that his hopes for the future and were pinned on. And so God told him to kill Isaac as a sacrifice to God. Abram intended to do it and took a trip to Mount Moriah and went up the hill with Isaac and was going to kill him, and God stopped him. A lot of people have trouble with this. They say, how in the world could God command a human sacrifice? Well, God could command anything he wants to, especially if he doesn't plan to let it be carried out. Abram had no laws. There had been no law of Moses. God had given no commands anywhere to the human race not to slaughter humans. Most pagan religions offered human sacrifices to their gods. The offering of a child to God or to Moloch or to Baal or one of the false gods was considered to be the supreme act of worship. Abram, remember, had very little religious knowledge. He was just a Middle Eastern sheep farmer, a product of his culture, who'd had a few messages from God with a very limited information. He wouldn't have any certainty that offering human sacrifice would be unacceptable to Yahweh. He didn't know. And so God was able to play on that ignorance, although God, as we see, was never going to let it happen. When God told him to sacrifice Isaac, one of two results could have happened. Abram could have said, no way, in which case Isaac would not be sacrificed. Or Abram could be obedient and says, okay, and God would stop him, in which case Isaac wouldn't be sacrificed. There's no way that Isaac was going to be sacrificed. God would not allow that. But Abram didn't know that, and that made it a fair test. As far as Abram knew, God was calling him to do that. The problem is that God had already told Abram that Isaac was the one through whom the nation would arise, through whom all the nations would be blessed. And yet Isaac wasn't even married and didn't have children yet. How is God going to fulfill this promise to future generations through Isaac if Isaac gets killed when he doesn't have any offspring? Now, we're not told that in Genesis, but in Hebrews chapter 11, we're told Abraham obeyed God on this occasion, believing that if necessary, God would raise Isaac from the dead. Now, the writer of Hebrews assumes that must have been what Abraham was thinking, because he knew that the promise had not yet been fulfilled through Isaac, and could not ultimately be fulfilled if Isaac died and remained dead. And yet, Abraham fully expected to carry out the instructions. If God wanted to, he was going to kill his son. But he must have assumed, but in order to fulfill his promise, he's going to raise Isaac from the dead. So that must have been what was going on in Abram's mind. In any case, God didn't let him carry it out. But the test was a severe one, and certainly showed that God had chosen the right man, because the man was placing God above everything that was precious to him on earth. Then in the next chapter we have the choice of a bride for Isaac. That's in chapter 24, I guess. And Abram sends a servant back to the place where his family had settled. Remember when Abram left Ur of the Chaldees, he came to Haran. He had brothers with him, 2 brothers. One of them died there, but one was still living. His father had died there. And it was from there that Abram left to go alone with his wife and his nephew to the Promised Land. But he still had relatives now in Haran, where he had lived, where his father had died, and where one of his brothers had died, and one was still living. So he wanted his son Isaac to marry someone closely related, because they at least would probably be worshipers of the same God. They weren't chosen like Abram was, but they were closer to Abram faith-wise than the Canaanites were. The Canaanites were worshiping demons. And he didn't want his son to marry a demon worshiper, so he told the servant, go back and find a bride from my father's family, or my brother's family. And so the servant went and he found Rebekah, and he brought her back to Isaac. Isaac then, of course, was married. And even Rebekah was barren for 20 years. It's an amazing thing how many important people in the Bible were born from women who were unusually barren, as they were barren for unusually long times. Sarah had been barren all her life until she was postmenopausal. Rebekah was younger, but was still barren for the first 20 years. It wasn't until until Isaac prayed for her, that she actually was able to become pregnant. But think of the test that Abram had there too. We're no longer reading about Abraham at this point, but he's still alive. And here, he had to wait 25 years before his promised son was born, and then he watches for another 20 years while his son's wife is barren. You know, how's this going to work out for him to become a great nation? Well, I mean, Abram's faith is still tested even by Rebekah's barrenness, and so is Isaac's. But Isaac prays, and then she becomes pregnant, and she has twins, Jacob and Esau. Now, Jacob is the younger, but God chooses Jacob to be the one through whom the family line will be carried out. Esau then becomes pretty much a nobody in terms of God's purposes in the earth, just like Ishmael had been. Ishmael was the firstborn of Abram, but he was rejected and Isaac was accepted. Esau was the firstborn of Isaac, but he was rejected and his younger brother Jacob was chosen. Now, Paul talks about this in Romans 9 and talks about how God didn't make this choice based on any good or bad that they had done. The choice was actually announced and made when they were in the womb. And some people, Calvinists in particular, argue that this means that God chooses some people to be saved and some people to be lost before they're ever even born. And they use it as an instance of predestination and unconditional election. However, that's not what's really going on there. It's not even what Paul's talking about in Romans 9. God didn't choose Jacob to go to heaven and Esau to go to hell. What God said, and Paul quotes God on this in Romans 9, he quotes it. God said the older shall serve the younger. It has nothing to do with where they're going after they die. It has to do with their earthly destinies. God chose in the family of Abraham one line and not the other to fulfill the promises on earth of bringing the seed into the world. This is not talking about who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. Nor is it really referring to them as individuals, because God says 2 nations are in your womb, and the older shall serve the younger. Again, it's the older nation that serves the younger nation. That is, Esau's nation, the Edomites, will serve Israel. That did happen generations later, not in their lifetime, that didn't happen. So the choice of Jacob over Esau, first of all, is not really a choice of individual eternal destinies at all, but rather national earthly significance. In every generation, someone of Abraham's descendants has to carry on the family line to bring forth the Messiah into the world. It would not be Esau. It was going to be Jacob. But the fact that someone is chosen to be the family line that'll bring the Messiah doesn't mean that they are personally saved. Now, I have no doubt that Jacob was personally saved. But even if he wasn't, he could have been chosen to be the one who bring forth the Messiah. After all, if you look at the genealogy of Christ in the New Testament, Lots of the people in his genealogy were not saved. There were idol-worshiping kings. There were all kinds of wicked people in Israel. There were whole generations where everyone was wicked, seemingly. Almost everyone in Israel. There were some bad people in Jesus' family lines. It didn't matter. Their purpose was biological, not spiritual. The purpose of Israel was to biologically bring the Messiah into the world. The moral condition or the spiritual condition of the people in any given generation who were in this family line is less relevant. The choice of Jacob over Esau has nothing to do with their eternal destinies or their spiritual qualifications for anything. It has to do with which line is God sovereignly choosing to be the line that will bring forth the nation that will bring forth the Messiah. That's all it's about. And so there's not much more about Isaac. God already announced that Jacob would be the prominent one and not Esau. But there was still some question in Esau's mind about that, apparently. Esau still thought of himself as having the birthright, which is what would naturally fall to the oldest son in the family. Now, a birthright in the Middle East, again, had nothing to do with salvation. Every family that had a son, or more than one, had a son who had the birthright. The firstborn son would have the birthright, generally speaking, by nature. The birthright simply meant that when the father was gone, he would be the new head of the clan. The son who had the birthright would succeed his father. Also, in terms of physical inheritance, if there were several children in a family, the son who had the birthright, which is normally the firstborn son, would get a double portion of the inheritance. That was very common, both in Israel and also in Middle Eastern cultures generally. What that means is, for example, if a man, let's say a man had 6 sons, and when he died, his inheritance would be divided 7 ways. The first son would get 2 portions, and the other 5 would get 1 portion each. So the one with the birthright gets a double portion. It's twice as rich as his brothers, and also becomes politically the head of the family clan or whatever. So that's what a birthright was. Esau, being firstborn, would naturally have that, but he sold that to Jacob. We have a story about it where Esau was out hunting, came home famished. Jacob was in the kitchen cooking up some lentil stew, and Esau says, "Give me some of that stew." And Jacob said, "Gladly, just give me your birthright." It's a modest proposal. Give me all your wealth and all your prestige that you'd have by natural birth. Okay, why not? Esau says, "What good is it going to do me if I die of starvation?" Go ahead. And the Bible says, thus Esau despised his birthright. That is, he didn't regard it as he should have. You see, in his case, the birthright would not only include what birthrights in any family would include, double portion of the inheritance and so forth, but in that particular family, the birthright would tell who's going to be in the line of the Messiah. Because this is Abraham's seed we're talking about here, which in every generation, one party would be the one to carry on the family line. Later on, Jacob had 12 sons, and Judah was the one who carried on the family line. So basically, Esau giving up the birthright was not only his disregarding the material benefits of a birthright, but even the spiritual significance of being the one whose offspring would bring forth blessings to all the nations of the world. He just didn't care for that much. It says in Hebrews chapter 11 that for one morsel of food he despised, or he sold his birthright, and it tells us, or it's chapter 12 actually of Hebrews, it says, don't be like him. Don't be like Esau. Don't be a fornicator or a corrupt person or a profane person like Esau, who for a morsel of food sold his birthright. Basically, Esau is given in Hebrews as the example of somebody who wanted short-term fulfillment and didn't care about long-term spiritual things. And he says, and that's why the writer of Hebrews says, don't be a fornicator or a corrupt person like Esau. Esau is not really necessarily a fornicator, but he's like a fornicator. He's a corrupt person, and fornicators are like him. Why? Because when you fornicate, you're giving up your spiritual purity, which is of great value. What for? A moment's satisfaction, really. A very short moment of satisfaction, which a godly person, if they happen to succumb to that temptation, will greatly regret immediately afterward. And even a person who's not godly, they might have reason to regret it afterward. But the point is, it's a moment of pleasure for which you sacrifice something of great spiritual value. Your purity, your innocence, your your virginity if it's the first time. Those are very valuable things to give up for what? For a bowl of pottage? For a single meal? That's what the New Testament makes Esau out to be, sort of the prototype of somebody who gives up something of almost infinite value for something that's just immediately gratifying. And then later on, when it seemed like Isaac was going to die, it was time for him to call his sons and give them the patriarchal blessing. Now normally, the son with the birthright would get the patriarchal blessing. That's another thing. Basically, that's part of him inheriting the father's role of leader in the family. The blessing of the patriarch would be, you know, may all your sons serve you, and may you have all the prestige and wealth that I have, and things like that. That'd be the kind of blessing a dying father would give to the son that had the birthright. Well, Esau here had sold his birthright, but years later when his father's dying, he wanted to get the blessing anyway. And his father wanted to give it to him because Isaac wrongly favored Esau. Why? Because Esau was a man's man. He was an outdoorsman. He hunted. He was tough. He smelled bad. Now, Jacob was a girly man. He was his mama's boy. He was cooking in the kitchen when Esau came in from hunting, for crying out loud. The Bible says that Rebekah favored Jacob, he's described as a smooth man. And his father favored Esau, who was a hairy, rough man. In fact, the name Esau means hairy. The name Edom, which was also another name, means red. When he was born, he was covered with red hair. Can you imagine a baby born covered with red hair? And we're not just talking about on the head. On his body. He must have looked like an orangutan. I mean, think about it. Think about it. How hairy was he? Well, in the story about how Jacob deceives his blind father into thinking he's Esau, how did he do it? His mother took goat skins with the hair on them, strapped them to his arms and neck, and when his blind father felt his neck and arms, said, "That's Esau." I mean, the man was as hairy as a goat. Amazing. He was like the Sasquatch or something, you know. So anyway, we find that Jacob impersonates Esau. His dad wants to give Esau the blessing, which is a wrong thing to do. First of all, Isaac certainly knew that God had told his wife Rebekah that the older shall serve the younger, which means that Jacob should be prominent, not Esau. So Isaac was kind of going against that birth oracle given to his wife. And then he probably had heard that years earlier, Esau had sold his birthright for a bowl of pottage, but that didn't matter. He still favored his favorite son. He was going to sneak the blessing to him anyway. But Rebekah, who favored Jacob, she overheard the plan. And while Esau was out hunting, Jacob came and kind of impersonated his brother and got the blessing by stealth. And so Jacob got blessed, which is really in the sovereignty of God what was supposed to happen. Strangely, God used bad people doing bad things all the way around. Isaac was wrong to want to give the blessing to Esau. Esau was wrong to try to get it. He'd already sold his birthright. Rebekah was wrong to deceive her husband, and Jacob was wrong to deceive his dad. Everyone's in the wrong. There's no good guys in this story. And yet, through all these people's misbehavior, God sovereignly works it out that his plan is fulfilled, that Jacob gets the blessing. Now, Esau is upset about this, so Jacob has to flee, and he flees to the same place his mother came from, Paddan Aram, which it's called at that time, which is Syria today. And he finds a wife there. Actually, he finds two wives there. He only wants one. He falls in love with his cousin, Rachel. She's beautiful, but she has an older sister named Leah who's not so beautiful, and Jacob's not interested in her. He's in love with Rachel. So her dad, Laban, says, well, if you serve me for 7 years, you can have my daughter to marry. Usually people had to pay a dowry to marry. Someone had to pay the father something. So Jacob didn't have any money, so he said, work for me for 7 years, and you can earn Rachel. Well, after 7 years of working, there's a wedding. But the bride is always veiled until the wedding chamber. And so Laban sneakily puts Leah in there And Jacob finds himself married and consummating with Leah. And in the next morning, when it's light enough to see what's going on, he sees he married the wrong woman. He complains to his father-in-law, and he says, well, in our country, we don't give the younger daughter away first. The older has to go first. But you can have Rachel too if you work for me for another 7 years. And Jacob said, well, okay. So he got Rachel, and then he was bound to work for another 7 years. During that time, he had 2 wives. Rachel, as it turns out, like Isaac's mother and his grandmother, Jacob's mother and Jacob's grandmother, was barren. Rachel couldn't have any kids. Leah, on the other hand, had 7 kids for him. 6 sons, including the oldest, several. So the ones that would have the birthright by nature were Leah's sons. And 1 daughter named Dinah. Now, Rachel saw that her sister was having all the kids, and it made her upset. And they got into a competition about who could make Jacob happier by giving him more kids. So, as it turned out, Rachel did what Sarah had done. Said, here's my maid, my slave girl. Jacob, have some children by her. So her maid bore 2 children for Jacob. Now Leah, in the meantime, had stopped having kids, so she gave her maid to Jacob, and 2 more kids were born to him. And finally, God opened Rachel's womb, and she had 2 kids also. So Jacob had children by 4 women, 12 sons in all, of whom half of them came from Leah, and 2 each from the other 3 women. Now, there's something interesting here, because Judah, whom Christ came through, was from Leah. And Leah actually shows herself to be much more apparently godly than Rachel. When she names her first 4 children, she names them with reference to God. You know, Yahweh has blessed me. Yahweh has given me a son. Yahweh has seen my sister's mistreatment of me. Even Judah means praise Yahweh. The word Judah means praise Yahweh. Now, when Rachel had her kids, she didn't name them anything that had to do with God. We find Rachel later stealing the idols from her father's house. She's not a godly woman. Leah at least has some semblance of godliness about her. There's a good reason to think that God's will was simply for Jacob to marry Leah, although she wasn't the prettiest of the sisters and not the one that Jacob wanted. Jacob ended up with her by a ruse. Now, we might say, well, he felt justified in going for Rachel after that because he had been deceived to get Leah. But hadn't he deceived his own father to get the blessing? He never considered that was illegitimate. Jacob had deceived his own father and gotten a blessing through deception and considered that to be valid. His own father deceived him and he got the wife he didn't want. Why didn't he consider that to be? Well, I guess God did it that way. Instead, he worked more to have Rachel also. And yet it was Leah who gives evidence. She gave him half of his 12 sons. She was more godly than Rachel, and she gave him the son who became the ancestor of the Messiah. In other words, Judah was that generation's chosen one, which is interesting. And yet God used the arrangement, even though Jacob probably did the wrong thing by marrying the other women. God used it anyway because Rachel also gave him 2 sons. One was Joseph, and he ended up saving the whole family, in fact, saving the whole world from starvation. And then there was Benjamin. So he's got these 12 sons. Now, Rachel was his favorite wife, so the 2 sons that Rachel gave him were his favorite sons, Joseph and Benjamin. So much shown to be so that, and Rachel died in childbearing with Benjamin, so there weren't going to be any more from her, that he showed such favoritism to Joseph and Benjamin that the other brothers were very jealous. Now, of course, Joseph was one of the youngest sons and therefore would not be considered to be in line for the birthright. And yet it was clear that his dad wanted to give him the birthright. He showed such favoritism to him, made him this coat of many colors, which is like a royal garment. It's almost like saying, you're the one who's going to rule here over your brothers. And Joseph even had some dreams to that effect. He had a dream that he and his brothers were out gathering sheaves of wheat, which was part of their duties, and the sheaves of wheat of his brothers bowed down to his sheaf of wheat, which was a basic suggestion that his brothers are going to be subservient to him. He had another dream that the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed down to him. Even his father got upset about that. Says, your mother and I and your 11 brothers are all going to bow down to you? But these were dreams from God. This is basically true, but not welcomed news from his brothers. And they wanted to do away with him. After all, if he got the birthright, they wouldn't. Their dad was very wealthy. By the way, every generation after Abraham was very, very wealthy. God was blessing him with a lot of wealth. And so these guys would be glad to get rid of Joseph, who they resented anyway for his favor, the favoritism he received. And also he's a threat to their inheritance if he's going to have the birthright. So we know what happened. They sold him into slavery into Egypt. And thus begins the story of Joseph in chapter 37. In chapter 39, we find him sold to a man named Potiphar, where he is a slave in Potiphar's house. He's a good man, Joseph. He feared God. And we have to remember what his circumstance was. He was sold into a pagan land where every single person but him was a pagan. He had no fellowship with other Christians. He had no fellowship with other believers. He could have compromised and gotten away with it. No one would care. His dad would never find out. His brothers would never find out. There's no one to hold him accountable. And yet he's this unblemished character. He's first of all a slave in Potiphar's house. And he's so responsible and honest that Potiphar elevates him above all the other slaves and makes him the manager of the whole house. And Joseph's a handsome man and a competent man, and Potiphar's wife begins to want to seduce him. And she tries several times. He resists. Finally, she grabs his clothes and tries to pull him into bed. He runs off and leaves his cloak behind. And, hell has no fury like a woman scorned. And so she was very insulted by his rejection, and so she decided to get back at him. When the husband came home, she said, this man tried to rape me, and I have his clothes here to show it. He ran off when I began to scream for the help, and he ran off and left his cloak behind. It says Potiphar was very angry, and he put Joseph in prison. Now it's interesting, he was very angry, but it doesn't say he was angry at Joseph. If he believed his wife's story, if his slave had tried to rape his wife, there'd be more than prison to pay for that. That'd be execution. He would have had Joseph executed if he thought Joseph really did it. And yet he couldn't ignore his wife in favor of a slave. He couldn't do nothing. I think he was angry at his wife. I think he knew what kind of character Joseph was, and he knew what kind of character his wife was. He was married to her. And he had found Joseph to be so reliable and so honest and so forth that it's like accusing Brett Kavanaugh of raping a woman or something like that. The man's character, he's been through 6 FBI background checks. He's spotless. He's squeaky clean. He was a virgin until he was out of college. And here's this woman saying he raped her in high school. It's like, and she's got some baggage. It's like 2 reports, unverifiable. It's her word against his and his against hers. But anyone who knows the two would know who's honest and who's not, probably. I'm assuming. Certainly, Potiphar knew Joseph, and he knew his wife. His wife clearly was not honest. She was lying to her husband right there, and not because of anything except spite against a good man who wouldn't sleep with her. Now, obviously, she's a wicked woman. Joseph had in all ways shown himself to be squeaky clean. And I believe Potiphar knew very well his wife was lying, but he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't say, well, I'm going to ignore you, honey. I'm going to believe the slave. Culturally, you don't do that. The slave is like animals in the house. If your dog bites the neighbor's kid, you kill the dog no matter how much you like the dog. You may be angry, but you have to get rid of it. But you just can't favor the dog over the child. And he couldn't favor the slave over his wife. I think it just made him angry. He's losing the best man he had in the household, the best manager of his stuff he'd ever known. He's going to have to keep his wife, but he didn't kill Joseph, which is very strong evidence that he didn't believe that Joseph had tried to rape his wife. Instead, he put him in prison where he was able to rise to prominence among the prisoners. Everywhere Joseph went, he rose to prominence. As a slave in Potiphar's house, he rose to prominence over the slaves. In the prison, he rose to prominence over the prisoners. The keeper of the prison gave him favors, favored status and so forth. And in prison, he met two officers of Pharaoh who had displeased their master. Apparently, this is reading between the lines, apparently some kind of crime had been discovered in the Pharaoh's house, and it wasn't sure who was guilty. Probably some poison had been found, and someone is suspected, either his cupbearer or his baker was suspected of intending to do harm to Pharaoh. So they were both put in prison until their cases could be investigated. In prison, they both had dreams the same night, and Joseph was able to interpret their dreams. Just like he had dreams, he interpreted other people's dreams, which served him well later on with Pharaoh. But one dreamed, the baker dreamed that he was carrying, well, the butler, who was the cupbearer for the king, dreamed that, there were 3 days, and then he was giving the cup back to the king. And it was actually represented symbolically in the dream, but Joseph said, hey, that means in 3 days from now, you're going to be back in your office again serving the king. And the baker said, oh, that sounds good. What does my dream mean? I had baskets on my head of bread and 3 baskets of bread, and the birds came and ate the bread. He said, well, that means in 3 days you're going to be hung. Now, that actually happened. 3 days later, the butler was restored to office, and the baker was hung. Reading between the lines, we have to assume that the investigation went badly, and the baker was no doubt found to be the guilty party, and the butler was exonerated and returned to his job. But when Joseph made the prediction to the butler, he said, remember me, when you're restored to your place with Pharaoh, speak for me. I'm a prisoner here. I was kidnapped from my home. I didn't do anything wrong. Let me out of here, And the butler, no doubt, said he would do so, but after he was returned to his position, the butler forgot about Joseph for another 2 years. However, 2 years later, on the king's birthday, there was a dream that Pharaoh had. In the dream, there were 7 fat, wholesome cows that came up out of the Nile, and 7 really skinny cows that came up and ate the fat cows and were still as skinny as before. Likewise, there were 7 heads of grain that were fat and full, and then they were replaced by and consumed by 7 wasted, scrawny heads of grain. Now, Pharaoh didn't know what that was about, called in his magicians and his astrologers and his counselors, and they couldn't make any sense of it. So then the butler says, duh, I know a guy who can interpret dreams. And so Pharaoh calls for Joseph. He gets cleaned up and shaved and comes before Pharaoh and tells him, hey, this is like a no-brainer, but God's showed you what's going to happen. Cows, grain, hey, that's food, right? The fat cows, the fat heads of grain, that represents 7 years of plenty of crops and food. But the 7 scrawny cows and 7 scrawny heads of grain represent 7 years of famine. So what I'm telling you is you're going to have 7 years of prosperity, but then there's going to be 7 years of famine. I think you should use the 7 years of prosperity to store up grain for the 7 years of famine. And the Pharaoh said, dude, you're brilliant. I want you to run my country. And so, just as he had risen to the top of, Potiphar's servants and the top of the prisoners in the prison, he became part of the top of the country, which was the most powerful country in the world, and he was second only to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh just said, hey, you just take care of stuff for me. I'll just lay on the beach, And so Joseph became kind of the de facto ruler of Egypt. Now, what happened, of course, is the years of plenty ended, the years of famine came. And this famine was not only in Egypt, but everywhere, including Canaan, where Joseph's family still lived. Now, they thought he was dead. They'd sold him into slavery years earlier, like 20 years earlier. And they were close to it. And so they just figured he was dead. By this time, he had grown up. He was just a boy when they sold him to slavery. Now he's a man. He's got the little Pharaoh beard type thing and the caps and stuff, and he speaks Egyptian. They came to buy grain from the Egyptians because the Egyptians had stored up grain at Joseph's recommendation. So everyone, including Joseph's family, came to Egypt to buy grain. Now, when probably Joseph wasn't overseeing, individuals getting grain, but when he saw his brothers, he recognized them. And so he said, I'll take care of these ones. And so he dealt directly with his brothers. They didn't know who he was. They spoke in Hebrew to each other and thought he couldn't understand them because he was speaking Egyptian to them, but he understood them. And basically, he came up with a plan to see if his brothers were any different now than they had been when they sold him into slavery. It's clear he wanted to forgive them, wanted to be reconciled, but he didn't want to forgive them if they're no different. So he had a great test for them. He knew that after he had been sold and gone, that Jacob's favorite son would be Benjamin, the only surviving son of Rachel. And no doubt these other brothers were as angry at Benjamin and resentful toward Benjamin for being the favorite as they had been toward Joseph. So basically, he was going to put Benjamin at the mercy of these guys and see if they did the same thing to Benjamin that they did to him. And that explains all that he did. He gave them some grain, but he had asked them about their lives, and they'd said, we have another brother at home with our dad. And he said, well, I'll give you this much grain, but you can't come back for more unless you bring your youngest brother so I can know you're telling the truth. Well, they didn't want to do that. But he said, I'm going to keep one of you here for security reasons, and I'm going to put you in jail and keep you until you guys come back for more with your brother, your younger brother you told about. Now, they had to come back because they ran out of grain, and so they came back a year later, and they brought Benjamin. Jacob was very reluctant, but he had no choice. He had to send Benjamin. They were going to starve if he didn't. So Benjamin comes back with the brothers. And Joseph still doesn't reveal who he is. He gives them grain, he treats them well, and he sends them off with their bags of grain, and Benjamin with them on their way home. And also the son that had been put in prison was released, so all 11 of them are going home to their father. But then Joseph says to his servant, an Egyptian, pursue them, catch up with them, and say, how come you stole my divining cup? And so the servant comes to him and says, why did you, after we showed some kindness to you, why did you steal my master's divining cup? Don't you know he can divine with that? And they were indignant. They knew they hadn't taken it. They said, well, what do you mean? We haven't taken any cup of his. If you find it with any of us, let that person die. Well, it had been hidden by Joseph's instructions in Benjamin's sack. And the story goes, they went from the oldest to the youngest, so the tension builds. They go through 10 sacks, there's nothing there. Now they're at Benjamin, and there it is. Now they said that he should die if he had it. They didn't know that Benjamin had it. And the servant said, no, he can just be my servant. The rest of you can go free. And Judah says, I'm not going home without him. It's a very moving story. I can't tell it without getting choked up. It's so moving. Because Judah is the real hero here. He says, keep me instead. Put me in prison. Let me be your slave. Let Benjamin go back to his dad. And Joseph apparently found that moving too. He started weeping. He said, I'm Joseph. Now imagine their shock when he said, I'm Joseph. This guy has their lives in his hands. And last time they treated him badly. As far as they knew, he was dead. They didn't care about his life. And now they find out Joseph's alive, and he's this guy who's got total power over us. And they were afraid that he's going to punish them, of course. And he says, listen, don't be afraid. God did this. God sent me ahead to keep you alive. So go tell my dad and bring him down here. So they go back and they tell Jacob how much humble pie they had to eat when they told. See, when Joseph had disappeared 20-something years earlier, or whatever it was, 12 years or whatever, I forget the exact number of years offhand, but they had told Jacob that they'd found Joseph's robe bloodied and probably killed by an animal. Now they have to go back and fess up. We sold him into slavery. They couldn't keep it a secret. They were going to have to come back to Egypt with their dad. If Joseph could send out the Egyptian armies to hunt them down if they didn't come back. They now were at his mercy, and they had to tell Dad, guess what? Joseph's alive after all, and I hate to tell you how he got there. It's our fault. They had to really humble themselves. But see what Joseph did by putting Benjamin at their mercy. They could have done the same thing to Benjamin as they did to Joseph. They could have said, Benjamin, sucks to be you. You got the cup. You go back to Egypt as a slave. We're going home. They sold Joseph into slavery in Egypt. They could sell Benjamin into slavery in Egypt and come back and say, Dad, sorry, we had no power over it. He stole the cup. He's gone. And if they had been unchanged men, they would have done exactly the same thing to Benjamin that they'd done to Joseph. And this is how Joseph proved to his own satisfaction that they were changed. And so they came to Egypt, and they lived the rest of their lives in Egypt. They died in Egypt, and their offspring lived there pretty comfortably because they're part of Joseph's family. And so what happens is Joseph himself eventually dies in Egypt, and they take his body back to the Promised Land and bury it in the Promised Land. And he takes an oath from them that when they go back, when God brings them all back to the Promised Land, bring his bones with them. That's what he says. They didn't take his bones immediately, but he says, because he had to be buried in Egypt, he was an Egyptian official, but he said, when you guys leave, take my bones with you. And so Moses, hundreds of years later, did take the bones of Joseph with him. So that's how Genesis ends, actually. It ends with Joseph dying and being put in a tomb in Egypt. And then centuries pass, and then the book of Exodus comes. And so we'll talk about that tomorrow. But that's basically the whole story of Genesis in a nutshell. All right?